Sure. Chuck Parrott. Hey, Chuck. Sorry, Trevor. We were on.
Oh, yeah, hi.
Hey, Terry. So it's Deputy Administrator.
Deputy Administrator. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, looks like we're ready to get started. I'd like to introduce Tina Nemesniowski, Assistant Deputy Minister with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and Charles Parrott with the Agricultural Marketing Service.
Thank you. Okay, I'm not necessarily technically inclined. Oh, there we go. Okay, I recognize that it has been an incredibly long afternoon. I guess we are very pleased that notwithstanding the length of the afternoon that there still are a number of people in the audience. So we're pleased to see that and obviously see this as an opportunity to have a level of engagement on action plan item number 29. So that while we might be at the bottom of the action plan list, we certainly believe that this particular initiative is an important one for our respective countries. So we're going to do a bit of a shared presentation, and it's going to follow the outline that you'll see on this slide. So, just to remind everybody, the action plan was released back in December of 2011, and in relation to this particular initiative, the proposal on the table is that we would be looking to establish comparable approaches to achieving the common goal of protecting Canadian and U.S. fruit and vegetable suppliers from buyers that default on their payment obligations. And in relation to the focus of this particular initiative, it is really focused on what's going to happen on the Canadian side of the border. We definitely have had a number of months to do work in this area. Both Chuck and I are new to the file and recognize all of the work that has already been done, but certainly believe that there is still work that needs to proceed over the coming months. You'll see the second bullet on this slide makes reference to the fact that on the 2nd of April, Canada confirmed a decision, which is not our final decision, but it was a decision that was announced on that date, given a commitment that had existed in the previous work plan associated with this initiative that essentially said that Canada would make its decision known by March 31st, 2013. So we've certainly felt an obligation to provide some information in relation to what the Canadian government was prepared to do. But the reality is, at this point, we feel that there still is the need to do further work on additional measures or additional complementary financial risk mitigation measures that the Government of Canada could consider going forward. But what we did announce on the 2nd of April is that we were going to take advantage of the work that we've heard about today by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, where they made reference throughout the day in their various presentations to the fact that they are undergoing a pretty comprehensive review and regulatory reform in the context of the Safe Food for Canadians Act. And related to that act is going to be a review of the licensing provisions that currently exist that deal with licensing and arbitration and have an impact on fresh fruit sellers operating in Canada. So we see that as an opportunity, and it is definitely our intention to take advantage of that opportunity and to see how we might be able to use licensing to push the agenda to ensure that we're able to offer more than what we currently do in relation to financial risk mitigation for fresh produce sellers. So you'll see there's a sub-bullet that makes reference to the fact that we certainly believe that a single licensing approach within Canada will help improve risk mitigation measures. And just to step back for 30 seconds, some of you may or may not know that we currently have a licensing approach that essentially calls for the licensing of fresh produce buyers unless they happen to be a member of the DRC. The DRC membership I guess, is quite rigorous relative to the provisions that currently exist with respect to the Canadian licensing regime. And while 90% of buyers are members of, that operate within Canada, are members of the DRC, there are 10% who are not and who are able to take advantage of what we believe are less stringent requirements that are captured in the current Canadian approach to licensing. So our intention is to eliminate the dual nature of our current approach and have a single licensing regime that will allow us to increase the rigor and the government's expectations with respect to fair and ethical trade and how buyers are expected to behave. The other thing that we announced was that we definitely see there's potential to go beyond a single licensing approach, and that we're undertaking further analysis around what potential complementary measures might be that would be complementary to licensing. And our ultimate objective, just to reaffirm that, is that we fully have the intention to develop a made-in-Canada solution that ensures the Canadian approach to financial risk mitigation provides comparable outcomes to what is offered in the United States. So further to that decision and announcement in early April, we've had some discussions on the Canadian side of the border where we've had engagement with Canadian industry, although I would say that some of the industry associations that we've had dealings with certainly have members that cover both sides of the border. And we've also had further discussions within the Government of Canada, to further explore those additional risk mitigation measures. Made reference already to the fact that the Canadian Food Inspection Agency has launched already their regulatory modernization agenda, and they formally launched that on the 4th of June. So I just wanted to highlight that for the audience. And that, again, we're using that mechanism as a way to do further consultation on the single licensing approach. The one thing that I will say that, again, we heard that repeatedly throughout the day, that our various regulatory agencies are very much focused on ensuring, safe foods for Canadian and U.S. citizens. So when it comes to licensing, some of the provisions of licensing that we think we would like to pursue don't really deal with issues of ensuring safe food for Canadians or U.S. citizens. They really deal with helping to ensure that sellers are protected and that buyers are doing the right thing. And so it will be the Canadian Department of Agriculture and Agri-Food that will be doing further and deepened consultations on the issue of a single licensing approach, and we will be doing that over the summer months. And certainly that will be an opportunity to consult more deeply with industry around, some of the potential provisions that we would like to pursue or that could be pursued in the context of licensing. The other thing I'll mention in the context of this slide is I did make reference to the fact that there had been a previous work plan that had been made public associated with this particular initiative. And at this point, we believe that there's a need to, update that work plan, and so together we're working on a new critical path. So, next steps and key issues. I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, who will speak to the rest of the slides in the deck.
Thanks, Tina. Looking ahead basically is what I'm going to be doing here for the rest of the slides. As you can see from the slide, July, August, as Tina mentioned, Canada is going to be lead consultations with stakeholders about the single licensing approach. And I think the important thing to point out here is stakeholders would include both U.S. and Canadian. We had a conversation about that yesterday, and I think that'll happen, so that'll be helpful. July through September, mostly internal deliberations by the Government of Canada as these ideas for how to move forward start to coalesce. I think there's going to be they need some time to sort of think through this as to what might be practicable. Really the key month is when we get down to October of 2013, because Canada at that point will finalize their analysis of the complementary measures. And again, what we're looking for here is focusing on comparable outcomes, because we understand that It could be a trust like we have in the United States, but it could be something else. But really, the goal here is to find something comparable. And then also in October, again, there's going to be more stakeholder engagement, because I think once Canada has been able to decide what would work best, they can then go back out to the stakeholders on both sides of the border and get feedback. And I think this is where really we as a government and in the industry on both sides of the border will have a good opportunity to kind of see where things would go from there. So I think that's a positive thing. The next steps, again, after the meetings with the stakeholders, Canada will have the opportunity to, they may want to tweak the recommendations based on input from Canadians and American businesses and governments. But again, we're looking for comparable outcomes. Key considerations, again, they've committed to providing regular updates. And, as I mentioned before, Tina and I had a very good discussion about this yesterday, and I think Canada will do their utmost to keep both sides of the border regularly informed as to what's going on. We at the government of the United States will have an opportunity to kind of look at the path forward and see whether, it meets what we would consider to be comparability. So we'll have the opportunity to be engaged as well. Excuse me. And then once finalized, the draft food regulations will be consulted. And that will spring them forward then to start their legislative path forward to adopt that. As far as the RCC path forward, we are going to be working in the coming months to align ourselves. Having a common path between the U.S. and Canada we think is critical. We want to implement new and deeper stakeholder working group engagement. I mentioned all of the outreach that Canada will do, and I think we're looking for ways to how to improve that. Webinars certainly is one way to do it, but maybe we'd like your feedback too. If you all have thoughts, I think that would be helpful to both of us. We want to consider regulatory cooperation moving forward, and again, input from the stakeholders throughout the summer is going to be critical there. And then government discussions before the end of the mandate, and that really, as you'll see in the next slide, is going to come about March of 2014. So why don't we go ahead and spring forward. And this kind of graphically shows you what I just described, but you can see that by March of 2014 is really where Canada will be ready to then move forward with hopefully adopting whatever path is chosen. And in between there's a lot of opportunity for stakeholder engagement. So with that, we'll open it up to questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Tina and Chuck. And the floor is now open.
I'm Reggie Brown with the Florida Tomato Exchange, and would like to compliment both countries, and having had the experience of going back some 20 years and working on a very collaborative, very collegial effort that resulted in the DRC being constructed. I would encourage both governments to be open-minded and think outside the box, and understand that the solution to the problem, we may not know exactly what it looks like today, but the goal of the whole process is a solution to the problem. And it is a real problem, and a problem that causes problems on both sides of our mutual borders. And we appreciate the effort that the governments are taking, and encourage that collaborative work with industry on both sides of the border to find a solution that truly is a solution that fits within the framework of what is possible. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good afternoon. My name's Matt McInerney with Western Growers. I was hearing the terms comparability, complementary, comparative, and stakeholder input. Are either of you able to comment on to what point with the stakeholder input we've had to date and some of the concepts and ideas floating around, have you prioritized what some of those outcomes that could reach a solution could be? Mr. Parrott mentioned a possibility of a trust. Are there other concepts that are on the table that, with our time here today, you could get not into the weeds, but a high level, here's what we're thinking about? And I guess the ending comment is, how can we help you further, adding on the last 15 to 18 months of stakeholder input, research, suggestions, practicality of what may or may not work. And so whatever we're missing about further stakeholder input, love to hear that so we can help further.
Do you want to comment, John? Start?
Go ahead.
Thank you for that question. I think I don't at this point want to take any potential options off the table. I think as the start of the conversation, I mentioned that at the end of the day, most of the activity in terms of moving on risk mitigation is really on the Canadian side of the border. And in the context of looking at what's possible within the Canadian side of the border, we certainly have been doing a fair amount of thinking about the kind of reality we face in relation to the constitutional split between the role of the federal government and the role of the provinces when it comes to dealing with agriculture issues. It is a split jurisdiction, and there are certainly some challenges associated with that. But part of the reason we see moving with licensing at the outset is because our provinces have the jurisdiction over what happens within a province. And so you will have sellers selling into a province to a buyer that will only be operating within a province, and that buyer at this point in time is not regulated by the federal government. But we recognize that from the point of view of payment issues facing sellers that have their product only sold within one province and moved within one province, there are limitations around the kind of protection that they potentially are offered. And so we definitely see the need to engage our provinces, and they've made it pretty clear to us that they're unwilling to really have a conversation until we get what they refer to as our licensing house in order. And so we think that by moving on licensing, that really provides an opportunity to push jurisdiction, like provincial jurisdictions, to do something at the provincial level. When you look at the issue of deemed trust within Canada, that has implications for our Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act, and we've been doing some analysis around, what would that mean in practical terms. It would require legislative change, which it might not be as complicated an environment as it is here in the States in terms of trying to push legislation. But I can tell you that, and I did hear today, by the way, that the Farm Bill in the House done. Yep. I think that there are always challenges trying to move legislative change in either one of our jurisdictions. And so to the extent that we can do things without actually having to go the legislative route, sometimes they're easier and sometimes they're faster. That's not to say that we wouldn't be prepared to go the legislative route, but we want to see, are there other potential ways to kind of address that issue. In terms of some of the limitations associated with the deemed trust and how that would work in Canada, our conversations with experts within the Canadian government that deal with issues of bankruptcy and insolvency have pointed out to us that there are some, consequences of moving in that type of a direction in relation to, for example, lines of credit that are, held by sellers. It's kind of an immediate consequence that anybody that has super priority creditor status, which is what a deemed trust would mean in the Canadian context, would have a limitation placed on their lines of credit. And for, based on our understanding of the industry and the way that, lines of credit are used by the industry, that's probably a fairly significant consequence, and we want to understand that a little bit more. So we're not saying that deemed trust is off the table, but we are saying there are probably some real limitations associated with that in the Canadian context, and we need to understand those a little bit more. So if we don't do deemed trust, what are some of the other options? And so we've been having conversations around, how far could we push on licensing in a way that would actually help us get at payment issues. And our sense is we can probably push pretty hard and pretty far on issues that actually from a Canadian context are more frequent than potentially what happens in the United States, which is around, slow payments, no payments, or partial payments without, bankruptcy or insolvency coming into play, which is, again, why we're focusing on licensing. So we think we probably can push licensing pretty far. But in addition to that, we're looking at other potential options. Is it a question of insurance? And I know that that's something that always causes people to take a big, deep breath. But again, based on some of the conversations that we've had, it might not be such a bad option. But I'm not saying it is the option that we would pursue, but it's an option that we're examining a little bit more deeply, just to really understand, what the pros and cons of that might be. So those are, a couple of examples, and I'm sure there are more, but I can't think of them off the top of my head. Sorry, maybe one other thing that I would say is there have been a lot of work done, and in the slide deck there was reference made to the fact that there have been actual reports that have been developed, all of them having implicated industry in some way or another. And certainly we're using those reports to inform our own thinking, but we're doing additional analysis beyond what's in those reports.
Hi there, my name is Murray Rowe, and we're based, my firm is Forest Green. We're based in Toronto, Canada. We're a licensed consumer credit reporting agency, and we also partner with Dun & Bradstreet, the business credit bureau that has been around for over 170 years. And I'm kind of an outsider to this because our specialty is data and risk management. In the sense, I don't know much about the farming industry and fresh fruit and vegetables, but there are some interesting things when you talk about insurance that we provide data. For example, in many provinces, we assist insurance companies in auto-adjudicating that there is a correlation between how individuals pay their bills and how actuarials determine risk and premiums. Municipalities, for example, require micro-businesses like painters to have bonds, and those bonds are often driven using credit information. On medium and large enterprises, corporate insurance, there is a direct correlation between D&B risk scores and the premiums that individuals pay. Now, it's a balanced scorecard. There might be as many as 12 different data elements that go into determining the premiums and the risk, but I don't think that one should abandon the insurance discussion until you examine some of the off-the-shelf solutions that are available. And I want to be respectful in the sense that don't think of it in traditional terms of like getting car insurance, but there may be some interesting options that you should take into consideration. And I think driving the pricing along with appropriate risk data like credit bureau data might assist in automating that process and simplifying it.
Thank you.
Fred Weber with the DRC. I just have a question about transparency and maybe the process a little bit more. As you know, the two meetings that you referenced early on were facilitated meetings involving industry very heavily. Do you see that as the forum for moving forward? And if so, how often would you see doing that? Because we have been at this for a number of months, and it would seem to me that to have monthly reporting and to identify not only a path forward in continuing those meetings, but the actual role of the stakeholders in this, because as you know, in attending the recent meetings, stakeholders go way back in this. This goes back to the FETP group. We've been working on this for 15 plus years. So I would hope that we could get some kind of credibility with this stakeholders group that's been meeting, increase the transparency and the reporting. Just thoughts on that?
I certainly think it's important to continue to engage stakeholders. Well, actually, I should say we do. Don't want to put words in your mouth, but we had this conversation yesterday and really see a need to continue to engage stakeholders going forward and to do that on a regular basis. And I think that is one of the ways in which you ensure a level of transparency. But I would say at the end of the day, there will not be transparency around what we will recommend to government. In the Canadian decision-making process, once advice is provided to a minister and a cabinet, it's a confidential process, and that is not something that that as public servants we're permitted to divulge, because at the end of the day, cabinet works in a way that it's a secret deliberations, and decisions are made known once cabinet decides what the answer is, and they may or may not accept the advice that public servants actually provide to them. And then, the decisions are made public at some point in time, and sometimes it might take some time to make those decisions public, particularly if it's if there is a legislative proposal that's on the table. Those are only made public once a piece of legislation is actually tabled in our Parliament. So we have some limitations around how transparent we can get the closer we get to the point where we're actually providing advice to our minister, who then subsequently tries to convince his colleagues of a particular approach. But that's not to say that there wouldn't be transparency around the type of potential complementary measures that we're thinking about. And I think it's going to be really important to have a level of discussion around those complementary measures that provides us the ability to really understand stakeholder concerns, considerations in relation to those particular options, and that we have a very fulsome understanding collectively of what the pros and the cons are associated with each of the potential measures that are under consideration. At least based on my 20-some years in government, there's never a perfect option. There's always some limitation associated with whatever it is that you might be recommending to government. But I think there sometimes are better options than others, and that's why I think we really need to be doing the kind of analysis that gives us a deeper assessment of what some of the pros and the cons are, and how those options could work in a Canadian context, because a Canadian context is different than the U.S. context in terms of our Constitution, in terms of the role of provinces, in terms of the role of federal governments, in terms of our legislative framework, and how we have to work in that kind of a context. But I don't know, Chuck, if you have
Yeah, I mean, just
anything.
your point is well taken, Fred, and except for the blackout period that Tina described in the Canadian legislative process, up until that point, certainly we'll do everything we can, I think, to try to improve and have regular communication with stakeholders on both sides of the border.
And I can tell you one of the biggest questions, or most frequent question that's asked by members of our cabinet: where are stakeholders and what do they think? So it's in our interest to know that, and the only way you can know that is by having those kinds of conversations.
Perfectly understandable, and I agree with most of it. But what I heard you say early on, and I guess what I was trying to gear the question toward, certainly once it goes into the minister's office, it's the black hole, as somebody called it. But do you see a role for our current meeting group to begin to cross some things off the list and actually wind up with the 2 or 3 possibilities that become that recommendation?
I think 2 or 3 possibilities. Absolutely. But at the end of the day, we have a role in making the recommendation, and that's what we're paid for as public servants. But, going through and doing the analysis and doing the work around what those options are, absolutely. And I think we do need to continue that work, and I certainly have I was only at the first discussion, and I was only there for a very limited period of time. But I was quite enthusiastic with the level of engagement that I was seeing. And there was a comment that I guess you made the comment earlier about working and thinking out of the outside the box. And what I was seeing at that discussion was just that. Because I think thinking out of the box is required on the part of both government as well as industry. And so I think as we have the kind of engagement that we've started and need to continue over the coming months, we all need to be thinking outside the box, and we all need to be creative enough to consider, options that, in the past people might have thought were just verboten. Because I think at this point we should think about what those possibilities are. And things have changed, I think, in relation to, insurance, for example. And that industry has changed fairly significantly. And again, I'm not saying that that's the solution, but I'm saying I think we owe it to ourselves to be looking at all those possibilities.
Okay, I think we have time left for perhaps just one very short last remark.
Anne Fowley, Canadian Horticultural Council. Just so I understand what I think I saw on the slides, was July to September was when there were going to be 3 financial protection studies reviewed or looked at more closely, and that would give a couple of months to follow up on those, but that really then from November to March was when things would go offline, I guess, for lack of a better way of describing that. So for that July to October time period, like, is the work plan going to be updated? Like, what will be the transparency on some of this, so that the broader group of people who have an interest in this issue, beyond those who are in this room, will know what's going on and so on and so forth?
We definitely have talked about, putting out a work plan, and we're just in the process of trying to decide on what that might look like.
Okay, folks, I think we've run just a little bit over time, so thank you very much for your interest and your questions on this one. I'd like to now thank Tina and Chuck for their time.
Can I say one thing?
Final remarks?
No, I was just going to say that I recognize I could see a couple of other hands in the audience. And if there are additional questions that people would like to pose, I recognize we can't do it now because there's another session that follows us. But if there are additional questions, I'm here, and I don't know if you're here, but maybe you're here too. That we would be happy to to deal with people separately after the session.
Thank you very much for that.
Okay. Thank you.
So if I could call up the presenters for the Small Business Lens presentation, please.
Do you have all the other members? Tim Ward. Sarah Breslin.
Okay, folks, looks like we're ready to get started with the Small Business Lens presentation. I'd like to introduce Doug Band from the Regulatory Affairs Secretariat of the Treasury Board Secretariat in Canada, as well as Sarah Breslin and Tim Lord from the Small Business Administration of the Department of Commerce.
Thank you. Thanks very much, and thanks to all of you who have stuck around for what has been a very long day. We'll try to move quickly through this presentation and open up for conversation. Delighted to be with you today and with our colleagues from both the SBA and Commerce. Just to situate who we are at Treasury Board Secretariat, for those of you who haven't heard of that before, we are essentially the OIRA equivalent in Canada, providing central oversight of the regulatory process in Canada and support to a cabinet committee that approves federal regulations at both the draft and final stage. I think it's important to say that this project is a project unlike the others that we've seen discussed under the action plan, whereas the others are about essentially sector-based alignment strategies. This one focuses on the regulatory process writ large and generically, and it's really about making sure and having a good hard look at the initiatives that are occurring in both countries to bring about greater flexibility for small business as we develop and implement regulations, that we're doing that in a way that doesn't disrupt the broader imperative of alignment that we see under the Regulatory Cooperation Council. I should mention that the U.S. has been at this for quite some time, and as has Canada, but it was recently that the Canadian government, in announcing its red tape reduction action plan, that we in Canada, I think, caught up and really raised our game in terms of loosening and reducing the burden on small business. We talk about a small business lens. I should explain exactly what that means just very quickly. Essentially now, whenever a regulation is expected to impose $1 million or more in impacts on small business, three things happen. Number one, Canadian regulators have to work with small business to fill out a checklist that attests that they've done a really good job of consulting and engaging small business and considering the unique impacts that regulation may impose. Secondly, they've got to develop a more flexible option to the one that was initially considered, and it's got to be costed, monetized, and quantified. And thirdly, we've shifted the burden of proof onto the regulator to demonstrate why they can't adopt that more flexible option. And all of those things are published when the regulation is published for comment at the pre-publication stage. So that's available to industry to consider and to raise comments and to challenge the regulator if they haven't gone as far as perhaps they would have liked. So that's just a word about the Canadian context. But we were really delighted that this initiative was included in the RCC work plan, because it provides for, I think, all of us the opportunity to ensure that as implementation of both our efforts to reduce the burden on small business and our efforts to align between Canada and the U.S., our regulatory approaches and systems, that we do so in a way that is mutually reinforcing and that we're achieving simultaneously those two objectives. So I'll just move forward. And that really is the point that was raised earlier on this morning by, I think it was the representative from the Great Lakes Authority, who asked, are there any measures being put in place or contemplated to ensure sustainability, that the alignment that is being undertaken here isn't disrupted? And that's really what the focus of this project is about. It's about making sure, as we go forward, that as we consider more flexible approaches for small business, we're not doing that in a way that undoes the alignment that's either previously been in place or is being strengthened under the Regulatory Cooperation Council. So it's very much do no harm to alignment as you try to do good for small business. So you see the overview of the initiative on slide 3, and I'll ask Sarah and Tim to speak to the U.S. components of this. We've published the Small Business Lens initiative that's available on the Treasury Board Secretariat website, including detailed guidance that we expect regulators to follow. And we will be publishing in the fall an annual scorecard that describes the highlights of flexibility that has been provided. And the work that we've done to date so far has really been to share and to make sure that we understand in a very comprehensive and detailed way what it is and how we do this thing called application of regulatory flexibility as part of the regulatory process. So our implementation is really grounded in a common and mutual understanding of what each jurisdiction requires of its regulators. Sarah?
Yeah, so I'm just going to, kind of quickly go through the U.S. side for what we've done. So at the 3 to 6 month, time frame, so we've added new features and content to business.usa.gov, which, to give you a little bit of a background, it's a one-stop shop that connects businesses with the resources that they need, such as access to financing, or information on how to start exporting, or even things like disaster assistance or hiring veterans. And actually, I think I'll go to the last slide there to just show them a little bit of.
To the annex?
Yeah. Yeah, that's the last one.
Can you tell me where to stop? I can't see it from here.
Keep on going. This.
There we go.
Thanks.
Yeah, so as you can see there, they've added like a really kind of cool interface that's very user-friendly, eye-catching, very intuitive. So you can see things like if you want to go to something like access financing, go to the little dollar icon, just click on that, and then it would be taken to various federal websites that could kind of give you the information in that vein. There's also some kind of, you can't actually see it on that screen, but there's some kind of cool things like there's live chat, and then you can actually have resources for making an appointment with your local small business administration office, which is very cool. So moving on to the 6 through 12 month time frame. I was not actually here for this, but back in November 2012, so SBA met with their Canadian counterparts to discuss basically Canada's small business lens and also the Regulatory Flexibility Act and business.usa.gov. So it was a great kind of, I think, brainstorming session between the two sides, and I think it really informed the small business lens going forward. So it's a very useful meeting. At the 12 to 18 month stage, which is where we currently are, this is sort of the I guess we could call it kind of the fact-finding phase, and we want to help small businesses find out about rulemakings in general, and let them know that they've got a stake in this and that their voices can be heard. So we're really trying to learn from you. So we've done things like had a webinar. So Sarah and I, or our offices, our respective offices, together put on a webinar about the small business lens. And we found out from the small businesses that were on sort of how they found out about rulemakings, if they found out about rulemakings at all, and they kind of gave us input on ways that they would like to find out about these things. So that was very useful. As far as the beyond 18 months goes, this is where both governments, in whatever capacity, are really committed to helping small businesses, basically to make sure that regulations don't unduly negatively impact them. So this is really something that the RCC has given impetus to make sure that we keep on going with this. With that.
So as Tim mentioned, sort of step one was to really dig into the details and do the homework to ensure that there was a really clear and grounded understanding of what each jurisdiction does at the level of an individual regulation, as well as throughout the regulatory process and the life cycle. And I'm pleased to report that I think from all of our standpoint, we're very comfortable and confident that we really have a foundation here for future alignment to be maintained under the RCC as we respectively explore and implement flexible approaches as regulations are developed. So just to give you some of the highlights, in both jurisdictions, there's requirements for regulators to identify who specifically in the small business community is affected by the proposed regulation. They've got to develop a flexible option that is costed, as I mentioned, in both jurisdictions. And this is, in both cases, it's applied to regulations that are expected to have significant or substantial impacts on small business. So there is a triage that goes on. There is a commitment to deep engagement with the small business community to help us make sure that we get the design right and that we've understood the unintended, perhaps, impacts that regulations can have before we finalize the rule. I think it's also important to underscore that both countries are deeply committed to the reality that we're not in any way going to be compromising the safety that is provided for both to Canadians, to Americans, and to the environment that regulations provide. So there isn't in any way an intention to compromise risk protection, and that's very clear in both of the initiatives. Also, as I mentioned, there is this, what we call shifting of the burden of proof, a reverse onus that both jurisdictions now impose on the regulator. So they've got to be transparent, and they have to be rigorous in their analysis, and they've got to defend why and if they don't feel that they can, for risk management reasons, adopt the more flexible approach that the regulation could adopt. And then finally, as I mentioned, it's not on the slide, but we both have annual reporting requirements on how this is all working. And so we really feel comfortable as a group that going forward, we've got the basis for alignment of strategies under the RCC and as we implement flexibility for small business. It's very early days, as you can appreciate, in the Canadian context for our small business lens being implemented. It was announced in the fall, and so we're now starting to get on with implementation. So we're delighted, I guess, to have worked with our colleagues to determine that there is, in fact, a very common foundation for alignment going forward. And just on to slide 5, Tim mentioned the longer-term goals that we're trying to achieve, and here again, I think there's some both Canadian and American evidence of progress that we'd like to highlight for you. As part of the action plan on reducing red tape that I mentioned earlier, the government here again has really raised the bar in terms of transparency of the Canadian regulatory system and its predictability for business, both on the Canadian side of the border and beyond as well. As part of the reforms, Canada has introduced forward regulatory plans. This is something that the U.S. has had in place for some time, and I must say that I see some of our colleagues from OIRA present today, and we're really grateful for their role in helping us shape the Canadian forward planning initiative over the last year. But what it does is essentially we've revamped all of the websites of our regulators so that there's a common standardized look and feel to those websites that makes it much easier for business to navigate and to find the same kind of information on regulations, including the cornerstone item, which is these forward regulatory plans, which is each minister's 2-year forward plan of regulations that they expect to bring in over the coming 2-year period. And I think particularly for the small business community, one of the features that we've included in those forward plans is a flag for those regulations that impact small business, as well as a contact person and identification of the time frame for consultation opportunities. And so what we see here is for the first time on both sides of the border, jurisdictions have transparency tools that really can equip small business to identify, track, and engage with a regulator on those regulations that will impact them. And we're talking here both small businesses on both sides of the border. And so that creates, I think, a level playing field and a transparent opportunity for business to be engaged and to have their voices heard in the regulatory process.
Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to continue on this slide, actually. Can I just grab the remote? Thank you. For those of you who are not familiar with the U.S. model for small businesses, federal agencies have been measuring impacts on their rulemakings on small businesses since 1980, when Congress passed the Regulatory Flexibility Act. This act and subsequent statutes, presidential documents, and presidential memoranda have formed the framework for small business, to measure small business impacts in the United States. My office, the Office of Advocacy, is the independent voice for small businesses within the United States, and we also monitor agency compliance with the Regulatory Flexibility Act. Because of the RCC, Commerce and Advocacy are developing new ways to engage small businesses in the rulemaking process, particularly on rulemakings that will affect cross-border trade. And so now that as Doug has mentioned, that the U.S. and Canada have similar mechanisms to measure small business impacts, we're looking forward to exploring how these mechanisms can be used together to increase flexibility for businesses engaged in cross-border trade. I will go through this quickly because I think that Tim has spoken to this, but we are now in the 12 to 18-month phase. Canada will be highlighting examples of regulatory flexibility for small businesses in their annual scorecard, which will be out this fall in 2013. And on the U.S. side, we're going to be working with the small businesses, to find ways to let you know if a particular rulemaking will impact international trade, cross-border trade with Canada, and then also more generally to get you more involved in the rulemaking process. And so we really need you to work with us so that we can meet our deliverables under this 12 to 18 month period. And then beyond the 18 months, just to reiterate, U.S. and Canada will be looking at ways that we can use our very similar mechanisms to achieve greater alignment of our regulatory practices, and also small business flexibility. Once again, in particular reference or with regard to small businesses trading across the border. So I think that this will conclude our formal part of today's session, and we will move to questions, and we're looking forward to an informative discussion. To get us started, we have worked together to put together the questions that are behind you, and if you can speak to we're happy to hear and respond to any questions or comments, but if you can also speak to these questions, will really help us direct our activities as we move forward.
Yeah, I guess I will just, quickly read through them, and then you guys can get to them. But basically, so how can small businesses leverage the new regulatory process tools that have been developed, like the small business lens and forward plans? And how can we use the web to raise small business awareness of these tools, like something like business.usa.gov? Are there any other platforms you think that we could use? How can small businesses better engage in the rulemaking process? I think that some of you might know that there are places like regulations.gov where you can actually submit your comments, but is that easy enough for you? Is that intuitive enough? And which small business concerns with the federal rulemaking process warrant closer U.S. and Canadian collaboration? So with that, I will leave it to you guys to pass around the microphone.
Hi, this is Wendy with OIRA. Some of these, I think this week is Small Business Week, so we have a lot of small businesses here in D.C., and they might be interested in the various RCC plans, as well as the questions that you just asked about kind of engagement on specific rulemakings. Do you guys have any recommendations on how we can kind of just share the RCC with small businesses? Because it can be overwhelming. The rulemaking process, both on the Canadian side and the U.S. side, can be overwhelming for small businesses because they don't have the resources to be paying attention to everything that's coming out. But then these projects, which have some overarching opportunities for them, it's kind of hard to explain that these are available to them as well. So do you guys have any ideas for how we can help pare all this type of opportunity down for these small businesses that are kind of overwhelmed with maybe what's happening at the federal levels?
Well, from my office's perspective, we do a lot of outreach with small businesses. We hold many roundtables. Something that is a possibility, if for our office, is to travel to some regions along the border, hold roundtables up there. As Tim mentioned, we did a webinar last week. We are looking at conducting some additional webinars, perhaps focusing on a specific area of the work plan that might be of particular interest. I noticed that there are a lot of agricultural focused trade associations that would be interested in speaking with some of their smaller members. And then also my office has reg-alerts you can sign up for. I let people on our listserv know about the RCC through that mechanism. And we also like to hear from you about how you would like to hear about this and how you might be more easily able to digest this information also.
Hi, Jason McClinton with the Retail Council of Canada. I think, Sarah, you sort of touched a little bit on my question and suggestion already, but I was just wondering how much you've been engaging associations on this, and then like to the question up there, 2 and mostly 3, like that I think is a very effective way. Like for instance, we represent 9,000 retailers in Canada, 45,000 storefronts, the majority of which are small businesses, and so you could leverage that membership to get at some of the smaller folks that way. So I was just wondering if that's been part of it, and it sounds like it has been.
Yes, we do a lot of work with the trade associations. Quite often, that's how. Actually, when we did our webinar, we used this fantastic tool to poll the people that were on the webinar and ask them how they hear about rulemakings. And I think we asked them if they looked at the Federal Register, if they went to regulations.gov, if they didn't know about rulemakings, or if they heard from the trade associations. And I think 60% of small businesses on the webinar said that they hear about their rulemakings from their trade associations. So we do work with the trade associations. We know that small businesses really do depend on them. One thing I haven't done as much is work with trade associations in Canada. So that I think maybe that would be more for our Canadian counterparts, but I would also be happy to do joint calls or participate in that.
I appreciate that. Yeah, that's something that we're looking at is, can we do a joint webinar with U.S. interests and so on, and Canadians, so that everyone's sort of getting the same message. As you know, as Bob Carvey was saying, there's a good deal of outreach that's being led in Canada by the Secretariat in the Privy Council office, and so they're sort of leading the charge on a lot of that work.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Comments or questions? Take it back to the panel for any final remarks.
I myself would just like to say, as far as getting stakeholders involved, really we could definitely just use your help. So yeah, if you can let all your members know, just spread the word. So it's in kind of times of scarce federal government resources that we really depend on technology like webinars and things like that to keep the cost down, but also just plain old word of mouth. So keep up the good work as far as letting your members and folks about this know.
I would like to say thank you very much for coming this evening, and it was a pleasure to speak with you.
Exactly. We're grateful for everybody sticking around and staying late. We know there was a long day, and we do value and appreciate the feedback. It's great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, folks, with that, we are closing in on 6 o'clock and the conclusion of the RCC 2013 Stakeholder Dialogue. Thank you all very, very much for coming out and joining us. As mentioned, it was a long day, and we look forward to hearing from you throughout the summer during the dialogue. Cheers.
Okay. Let me